It is so nice to hear that everybody is enjoying conversation. This is going to continue, hopefully, for the rest of the session. We've had a long day, and I think this is going to be an exciting time for us to think about what we've done today, about who we are all together when we're in this room. So we're going to get going. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Sowparnika. Welcome to your next session. So this conference started with Kelly talking about collaboration and experimentation in terms of community and humanists at work. And that's what our next session is going to be about. So we have been working with Cindy over the past month to develop a session on community building. So Humanists at Work has always been about us coming together, right? And we come together now and then, and we have great productive sessions. We make amazing connections, and then we go back home to our campuses and to our lives, and that goes on. And then after 6 months, we see each other again, and it's again, once again, it's like great, right? So we were wondering, like, how can we make this into something more permanent? What is it that we can do to ensure that these connections continue in a productive way? So essentially, how do we build a community? How do we define ourselves as humanists at work? And how do we communicate this to different audiences that we have? And so for that, we have Cindy Au, who is our resident expert on community creation and community building. She is an advisor at Homemade, where she's working on building amazing user experience and growing a community of passionate food creators. And before this, Cindy was working as the VP of community at Kickstarter. So she has a pretty diverse background, and we thought that's like perfect. Also, as a English PhD, she also knows about grad community, and that also fits into what she can build over here and tell us how to build.
So first, Cindy's going to talk with us, and after that, we're going to work on an exercise that's on the flash drives. So if you do have your computer, go ahead and grab the folder that's on there, pull it into your desktop, and we'll be using the documents in the folder there called Building Collaborative Communities. And then one last comment. One thing we've noticed about these events is they're very long. At the end of the day, people jet off to their planes almost immediately, are exhausted, and have trouble thinking about these dialogues the very next day. And sometimes it's hard to follow up. So Sowparnika and I have really experienced a lot of collaborative tools in this process of working with Cindy and also with Kelly and the rest of the committee. We'd love to share some of those collaborative tools and tricks with you. If you're interested in collaborating in a number of projects that we will get in touch with you about later, please just consider filling out this card and maybe thinking about other people that you've met here or had instructive conversations with that have resonated with you. And we'd be interested in seeing what a later connection in about 2 weeks would look like. That said, we're going to let Cindy take it away.
Thank you guys so much for the introduction, and thank you, Kelly, especially for organizing this and inviting me. You know, when you first reached out, I was very excited because it's actually been a while since I addressed a grad community. But, you know, as with many sort of meandering career paths, it's a part of my background and experience that has always kind of carried with me through each role. So this is both a little bit of an experiment in terms of, you know, the type of talk and workshop that I normally do. So I hope you guys will sort of bear with, and definitely there's no prescriptive way to really do things, even though hopefully this framework will be helpful for you. So today I'm going to be specifically talking to you guys about building collaborative communities. And it's funny that I say this now because I feel like, especially at the end of this experience, it's kind of what you've been doing all day already. And really it sounds like something that you guys have been doing over time, over the years of this program. So, you know, in a weird way, I'm almost like, you guys are doing this thing. But what's important is really taking the time to reflect on how you're doing that, and sort of, you know, I think giving yourself the space to be a little bit meta about it. Because while you're in it, you don't necessarily see those components until it really starts happening. Oops. Okay, this slide is really for me to remind myself to actually introduce myself. and say a few things, because I always launch right in and I forget. So like, Rebecca and Sowparnika said earlier, my name's Cindy. I like Doctor Who. I think it's important to know a little bit about someone before you get to know them. So, one of the things that I kind of wanted to, I guess, give you guys a little bit of background on is how I got here, how I ended up in the sort of career moment that I'm at right now. So this is my super reductive resume, in a nutshell. Between 2001 and 2010, I was a graduate student. I finished my PhD in 2010. Between 2007 and 2010, I started kind of, my mind started to wander. I was like, wait a second, I'm not sure what I want to do next. So I spent a lot of time doing a lot of writing, and for a while I considered a career as a writer. And so that was a big part of some of the practice that I worked on as I was finishing the PhD. In addition to writing the dissertation, I was doing a lot of personal writing and writing on my own. And then after that, I ended up working for Kickstarter. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Kickstarter. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Then I will skip the spiel about what it is. And that was sort of my first foray into tech. And since then, I've worked in a lot of different startups in different capacities, mainly working in community and as an advisor. So that's my resume in a nutshell. But I think it's important to really think about how you really get somewhere, and specifically to think about how all those pieces play out and what was the sort of master plan. So I'm going to show you my master plan. So let's talk about those 10 years basically that I was a graduate student. Yes, I was writing a dissertation, I was teaching. I spent a lot of time feeling very anxious and panicked because there's a lot of uncertainty during that period. And at the end of it, I did in fact produce a dissertation. I think it ended up being about 186 pages, including the works cited, which, for those of you who are professors in the audience, it's a little bit under what is probably normally the best practice for dissertations. But my committee was very understanding of the fact that I was planning on kind of moving and not taking on that sort of tenure track professor track. So that was really what was happening as I was a grad student. I was very panicked. And I think this kind of echoes a lot of what everyone's been talking about today, which is that, at no point does it feel like there's this kind of clear plan, either within your programs or even within yourself in terms of how to sort of figure out the next thing. And that was something that when I look back, it would have been wonderful to have a plan. And hopefully in some ways, experiences like this can kind of help you map out some things a little more clearly and not sort of fumble and not feel like you have to be as lost as you're doing some of this work. So let's talk about that period of time where I was writing. I ended up being able to publish in a couple of actual brands on the internet that weren't ones that I created myself. But before I did that, I actually had to just go ahead and start putting my stuff out there. And that was something that was really important because being a public person is sort of that first step to starting to create a community and to really start kind of like building some of that. And it takes a little bit of hustle. So, definitely this is not a simple thing to do. It's not an easy thing, but it also isn't the hardest thing. Some of it is just going out there and seeing what's out there, seeing what you're interested in, and trying, because the worst thing that can happen is nothing. And so I spent a lot of time trying, and as a result of that, found a way to kind of get a couple of things out there that would sort of create this narrative that looked like I had a plan. Of course I want to be a writer. Of course this is what I've always been doing. And then, wavering, because as it turns out, writing for the internet is not necessarily the most lucrative career. And as I was getting paid about $20 per post, I was like, well, I'm going to have to write a lot to make this work. And knowing that I didn't want to be Henry James, I started looking into tech. And again, this was sort of just what was happening in 2009, 2010. The tech community in New York was starting to grow, and there was this kind of new field called community that was starting to spring up around companies that were really thinking about their user base very differently, not just as customers spending money, but as groups of people who are kind of coming together to do something. Kickstarter was one of those companies. The nice thing about Kickstarter and about tech at the time is that these companies were so new and these roles were so new that no one really knew what the role was. So imagine that you've written a job description, you're one of these companies, you don't actually know what you want, it just says you should be able to do everything. And so as an applicant for that type of role, I was like, cool, I can do everything. Whatever you want, you got it. And that was kind of, the foot in the door in this sort of strange nascent tech community, which is now very much more established, as well as the role of community in general. But at the time, it really kind of started from, we just want someone who's smart, who can communicate well, who's an analytical thinker, who's good with people. Does this sound familiar to any of you guys? Yeah. Never did they say we want a grad student. But when you really break it down, those were kind of those elements that certainly from being a graduate student, from teaching, from spending so much time engaged with different writing communities and different communities online, it ended up incidentally kind of preparing me for this type of role. So that's a little bit about me. So one thing that I think is relevant in terms of this story is thinking about that resume version of the self, and also the fact that you can make fancy charts very easily in Keynote. If you look at just that linear version of career, it's not very interesting. It's like, oh, I can teach, I can write, and I can strategize stuff. It feels kind of limiting. There's not much of a story there that I can feel motivated and get behind, and that I can communicate out to people. So what happens then if you look at your career not through the lens of these sort of linear skills, but as parts of communities that you belong to by virtue of being the people that you are? And that really, in a weird way, is kind of what I was doing. I was just like, well, you know what? I love science fiction. I want to write about science fiction. No one will ever pay me to do this, but I'm still going to do it because I love it. And those are some of the things that eventually kind of helped communicate out to the world, hey, this person cares about culture in a way that we're not really seeing necessarily. And so as I was, breaking down episodes of Battlestar Galactica and writing and hoping someone else would care, those were the sorts of things that, when I finally kind of landed at Kickstarter, they're like, hey, this person sort of understands these communities, and those are communities that are creative that we're really interested in reaching out to and learning more from. So when career and community intersect, I think there's something really beautiful that can happen, where it's like, wait a second, who cares about skills? There's actually all these different nodes that I exist in where there are interesting people doing interesting things, and it turns out no one has a very strong career plan, no one really knows exactly what they're doing, but you have these shared interests, and that is something that can be really powerful, especially when you're thinking about what do you want to do. And so when you look through the lens of community, you can kind of say, you know what? Who cares? It doesn't matter what you want to do. It's more about where do you want to be. And in some ways, I think that's about sort of liberating yourself from some of those things where, especially when you're in graduate school, you're always thinking about, what do I want to do? How am I going to get that specific job that I've been preparing for so long? And it doesn't really give you that freedom to say, you know what, where do I want to be? Sometimes that means, do I want to be in a city? And I know for a lot of you guys, those things matter. Where you live is, that's every day of your life. Sometimes it means, who do I want to be around? What communities do I want to be a part of? And so these sorts of questions, I think, can actually really open up ways of thinking about your career and your trajectory. So that's sort of some of my thesis around community and career and how important it can be to bring those things together. So in this next portion, I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the building blocks of a strong community. And this is stuff that really kind of, came out certainly through working with online communities at Kickstarter, and also really working with people in all these different sort of environments, working to bring people together offline as well as online. And of course, as someone who's a community builder, I have a community of community builders. Speaking of meta, and something that this community is really great at is sort of taking all of our shared experiences and shared knowledge and sort of creating frameworks. And so one of the frameworks that this community, it's called CMX, has helped kind of create is sort of, hey, what are the fundamentals of building a strong community? And that's really different from just any kind of community, right? You can bring people together for one day and you can kind of get something going that's like, all right, this feels good. But for it to keep on going, to be strong and engaged, that's where you need some of these pieces. So these are the 4 pieces. Number 1 is identity. Number 2 is trust. Number 3 is participation. And number 4 is reward. And I thought, as I was kind of listening to all the talks today, I was like, hey, this is kind of interesting because I think every single one of these components has really come up as both something that's sort of a part of these communities we're thinking about, but also stuff that might be missing, that might be harder to kind of figure out together. So hopefully, as I kind of walk you guys through this, it will make sense and there'll be a way to kind of apply this back into the grad community. So not surprisingly, identity is number 1. You've got to have an identity, one that everyone can align around, everyone that understands it, and that you can kind of build common goals around. So I think that's something that we have in this room in spades. I think, if we look at all the different ways in which we align, there's a lot of crossover. It's almost kind of scary. I almost feel like, whoa, we're all like doppelgangers, having lived like fairly parallel lives in some ways. Trust is huge, and this is something that I heard come up over and over again. A really strong community requires trust, both in its community members as well as the community as a whole. And I think that's something where, at this moment, we're not sure how to kind of really get that trust in every single participant, and specifically in people that we want to bring into the fold. So trust is huge, and it is the foundation. You have to have that. Participation is also important. If you do an event and no one comes, then where do you go from there? And I think this is something also that I hear a lot of people struggling with. And part of that is really thinking through participation as not, hey, how do we get people to come to us, but more, how are we going to them? So I really like to think about participation as something that involves a cycle, right? Both sort of creating something that's special, that will kind of encourage people to know where to come, but also going to them. So really meeting people halfway. And then reward. I think this is something that, in some ways it's weird to talk about, where it's like, oh, I have to be rewarded to be in a community. It's not really that. I think that a really strong community, an engaged one, naturally rewards its members. And so my guess is that you guys are here today because there was some sort of sense of reward that you might have at the end of it. Maybe you'll make a new connection. Maybe you'll sort of have a breakthrough in your career. Maybe you'll get some really practical skills about writing your resume. But in any case, I think all of those pieces, when you think about it, at the end of the day, it's reward that kind of keeps people feeling like, hey, this was worth my time, and I think I want to do it again. And you can see how that cycle can kind of kick off. So those are the 4 pieces. So to kind of go a little bit deeper into the model, I thought I would talk a little bit about how we built a really strong community foundation at Kickstarter. And there's also a fly buzzing around my face. So, when I asked you guys if you were familiar with Kickstarter, everyone nods your head. You're like, yeah, it's this thing. It's where people go and they make crazy things and they raise money for it. That is an identity that actually took a very huge amount of hard work to make very clear. And I think that's really important when you're thinking about identity. For us at Kickstarter at the time, we knew that we had built something that was really special that could be used to raise money to make something. But it wasn't about raising money for anything, right? So this wasn't for you to kind of like raise money to go out to a really nice dinner with your pals. It was really meant to be, hey, I have a creative project and I want to figure out how to do it. And I know I need funds and I know I need a community to do it. So in a way, our identity was really about creating a statement that was both inviting and that people could easily identify with, but that created some constraints, right? So it wasn't supposed to be, hey, everyone in the world, you should do this. It was, hey, everyone who's interested in trying something new, anyone who's interested in just creativity as a thing and values that, this is the place for you. So this tagline, Kickstarter is a vibrant community of people working together to bring new things to life, that's been true from day one. as you can imagine with something like crowdfunding, trust is huge. In 2009, 2010, when Kickstarter first kind of popped up on the internet, people were very skeptical. And that is completely natural, because we had built a system where you could literally give money to a stranger. And everyone's initial reaction was, are you kidding me? So how do you overcome a hurdle of trust that's that big? The precedents at the time that existed were things like eBay, where it's like, yeah, okay, you know, I bought a used car from a stranger on the internet, and that was like, yeah, that's crazy. So here with Kickstarter, we have people who are making films, who were writing books, and so we knew that without that trust piece, nothing was going to be able to happen. And so the two ways in which we really did that was both through thoughtful design and governance. And to kind of break that down, it meant that by design, our system was about creating trust. So one of the core mechanisms of how it works is that you set a goal, $100, let's just say, and if you don't reach that goal, no one actually has to pay any money. And that sort of model where it's like, hey, only with the communities, sort of everyone turning the key, that's when we kind of realize, hey, we've built this trust together. You have the crowd kind of coming together to do something. And by design, that sort of helped, because it was like, well, I'm not even really spending money, because it won't really, you know, it won't happen unless everyone else says it should happen. And this ended up kind of being that magic thing that made sure that, all right, even though this is new and kind of weird, everyone felt more comfortable if they knew that other people were willing to do so. And so if you think about what that means, it really is about trust kind of comes from lots of people all raising their hand and saying, yes, I want to do that, I will vouch for this. And that's exactly what the system was designed to do. And then the other really key component was transparency, both in how the system worked and also, I think, as our organization functioned. So Kickstarter was always really open about sharing statistics outward to the community about here's how much money has moved through our platform, here's how many people succeed, here's how many people fail. These are the types of numbers that most companies do not want to share, because they're like, oh no, failure, no, I can't talk about that. But with Kickstarter, it was like, you know what? Trust doesn't happen unless we admit that these things do happen. And hiding from it just makes it seem like something's wrong with the system. And in fact, by design, the system wants sometimes for people to fail. Because if you tried, you know, if everything you tried worked out, well, you'd be trying a lot of things all the time, and you'd be on the hook for all of them, which who has the time? But with Kickstarter, it really was supposed to be a way to kind of eliminate some of that risk that normally happens when you want to try something that might be a little more challenging. So that was how we really worked to build trust. I think participation is an interesting one, because there's a lot of different ways in which participation can happen. For us, I think that certainly, especially in the early days, the best way to kind of create participation was to model success. To literally show people, hey, if you try this, if you want to do this, if you try some of these kind of ways of talking to people and putting together this goofy campaign and setting a goal and doing all these things, something magical can happen. But people kind of have to be able to see and model out in their minds what the end of the road is, right? And so, you know, you can kind of start to see some of these parallels where it sounds like, you know, even the job that you might be training for, you don't actually know what that looks like. And so it's so important, really, to have those success modeled out and to have various levels of success modeled out. And I mentioned failure before, but this is something that I think is important for participation, which is that not everyone is going to end up in the exact same place, and that's totally okay. And in some ways, if things don't work out, that's also okay. In fact, I'm going to hazard to guess that in life, almost nothing works out exactly as planned. However, when we're out there storytelling, we tend to focus on just the successes. So you kind of see these people and you're like, wow, like look at all this stuff they did. It only took them 5 years to do it. And in reality, it's like they've been working for 20 years before that. You just don't see any of the labor that goes into it. So it's really important to kind of talk through those moments, to think about what ways does success actually kind of start with lots and lots of little failures, and really normalizing that. So that participation becomes a no-brainer. It's like, hey, I could succeed and I could fail, but this community is going to make it worth my while. And then finally, this is something that I mentioned earlier, really supporting our community where our community exists. So we never took for granted that like, oh, we built Kickstarter, y'all should just start coming to us. That's not really how it works. It's a lot of on-the-ground hard work. And so our team really went out and we said, hey, where are members of our community? Where do they need us most? Let's go to their art openings. Let's go to their film festivals. Let's elevate them in as many ways as possible and really get their story out there. And I think that's really, really important. It sometimes doesn't seem like the most scalable thing that you can do, but to me the payoff is immense, because when you sort of go out there and you put yourself out and say, hey, I want to do these things for you, that's when your community starts to see like, oh, cool, I want to do that too. I want to participate in this thing where everyone's helping each other and we're kind of together elevating this thing that we're doing. Because it's hard. I think with a lot of communities, everyone is kind of aligned around the fact that the thing that you're trying to do is actually really hard. And acknowledging that and sort of, breaking it down and helping each other out can be huge. And that makes a reward for participation obvious. So speaking of rewards, clearly with something like Kickstarter, there's a monetary reward if you are successful as a creator. That's a very extrinsic sort of reward. But I would say 90, and I'm not making this number up, I swear, 99% of people who've sort of had that success, when we went back to them and we said, hey, what did you love most about this experience? They never said the money. They always said it was the opportunity to actually try something for the first time without any of those crazy market pressures and people saying, oh, you have to be, the #1 movie on Netflix, or you have to be, the greatest album of all time. The sorts of pressures do not actually unlock creativity, they crush them. So it was nice for people to really have a chance to try some of those things. It was really also about, for the first time, putting something out in front of the community. So people really found that to be just immensely validating. And I think you can kind of extrapolate from there, like, again, why do community systems that are engaged work really well? It's because people feel that sort of excitement of, for the first time, like, whoa, there are other people like me going through this thing, and I feel kind of validated. I'm not alone. I have sort of like my people. So it was really a moment to kind of gather, one's people and one's tribe around them. And then, of course, the opportunity to actually grow that community. And in some ways, I kind of think that's what we're going to be talking about next. We sort of know, like, okay, we know that there's lots of people who are kind of in this position that we're in. We're at various stages of career. We're not totally sure what the end of that path looks like, but we know that we can learn from each other and help each other. But how do we get those people to kind of keep this conversation going and to kind of keep the roadmap for success going? And then the last thing I'll say is that for people who are supporting Kickstarter projects, it's obviously that feeling of, hey, I got to help someone else's dream come true. And that's just a really good feeling. And it's one that, in a day-to-day level, like, it's hard to kind of actually create that. And so when you think about, like, when do you have those positive vibes in your life? It's when someone can kind of like say, hey, I helped make that happen. So it's very empowering. So that's kind of my sort of deep dive into Kickstarter and community building and talking through some of those key points of identity, trust, participation, and reward. This next portion of the workshop, I'm going to have you guys kind of work